Good afternoon, and welcome to the first session of day one, Creating Self-Service BI Solutions with SharePoint Server 2010. I note before me we have a full attendance in this room, so just to let you know, if you're standing outside or you've got a colleague that you think may benefit from this session, there will be a repeat this afternoon in room D204 at 4:30. Okay, so what we're here to talk about is business intelligence. Let me introduce myself first. Peter Myers, I'm a BI consultant. I work for a Microsoft partner in the US. I'm actually not American, I'm Australian. But I've spent at least the last 10 years working in the business intelligence space, specializing in SQL Server and the delivery of business intelligence with SharePoint. In this session, we're going to talk about how we can empower our users to go ahead and create their own solutions. And you've got to think how magic this truly is, because if we can empower others to create solutions, that is going to remove a burden from our in-tray. Okay, so let's talk about what SharePoint BI can deliver. That breaks down into the topics of the Business Intelligence Center, the web parts that are appropriate for delivering business intelligence, and then we'll break down into the individual service applications and finish with a summary. Let me warn you up front, this is demonstration heavy. Some of the feedback I have had, having presented this at other conferences, like the SharePoint conference in Anaheim last year, is that way too much information for a 75-minute session. What I like to make clear up front is that it's really here to give you a feel for what you can achieve, not necessarily how you can become a master in each of the topics. All right, so be aware some of the demonstrations are quick-paced, but the objective is to see what you can do with BI in a 75-minute session. All right, can anyone define business intelligence for me? And it's a bit rough in a room like this. It's typically my starting point. I often quiz the audience to say, well, who considers themselves to be a business intelligence practitioner? And those that are brave enough to admit to it, then I say, well, tell me in concise terms what it is that you do. And I have to confess, more frequently and more recently, I get some answers that are pretty good. But when I used to teach these topics maybe 8, 9 years ago, people would really struggle to define what business intelligence is. So I'm not going to put you on the spot, but let's keep it in mind that with business intelligence, we're delivering answers to questions. Who asks these questions? Typically the business. Not necessarily IT people. They're the marketing managers, they're the HR people, they're the financial accountants, and so on. So the fact is that we store and collect large volumes of data today, and we need to make that available in appropriate ways, in the right time, at the right format, to the right people. And essentially, that's what business intelligence is. It's about improving insight. So SharePoint has a lot to offer in this space. So it delivers a centralized BI center that helps kickstart your business intelligence endeavors. We can use this to go ahead and store spreadsheets of reports, key performance indicator definitions, dashboards that present summary information that answer common questions. Typically, how are we going in a particular subject? Now, SharePoint also includes service applications, Excel services, server-side rendering of Excel workbooks, performance point services to deliver monitoring and analytics, defined through key performance indicators, scorecards, and reports. And Visio, you may well be familiar with, the diagramming tool, can be brought to life through server-side rendering of diagrams. And we'll see that in a demonstration today, whereby we can connect our data to the diagrams and allow information to flow through these diagrams. In addition, SQL Server extends the capabilities of SharePoint through add-ins with reporting services and Power Pivot. They're actually out of scope today. I wish I had time to talk about it. It provides a more complete discussion about delivering business intelligence in SharePoint, but they just don't fit into 75 minutes, and they often deserve a dedicated session. And there's no doubt at TechEd this week you'll find a session dedicated to Power Pivot. There are web parts that allow us to assemble business intelligence solutions, typically around dashboarding. This is what I love about SharePoint, is that we can make individual non-IT users web developers. They don't need to know how to code, but by providing them an interface, they can go ahead and create web part pages. And through these web parts, these pre-packaged functionality units, they can go ahead and enrich the web part page with functionality to construct dashboards and so on. So we'll see that there are filters, charts, and the ability to embed our Excel and Visio diagrams through the appropriate web parts. All right, so when we talk about delivering SharePoint BI, there's an audience that consists of the IT professionals. They're typically involved with installation, configuration, perhaps setting up data sources and maintaining them for reuse by our business users. The power users, analysts, and developers will go ahead and create workbooks, diagrams, dashboards, and reports, and may also assemble dashboard pages. That's pretty much the focus of today's session. So I'd like you to think, when you look at the demonstrations, that what I'm demonstrating could be achieved through a power user or an analyst. Finally, you have the information workers. They're the consumers. They're going to navigate to, browse to the dashboard pages, and go ahead and consume the information that is flowing through. So starting with the BI Center, this is simply a site template. It's a very quick way to kickstart your development into business intelligence. It comes with libraries already created, like the dashboards, data connections, documents, and performance point content. For my demonstrations, I have started with the BI Center. To me, it's a starting point. I then enrich it with additional libraries and capabilities that make sense for the audience that we're working with that library. And then introducing the BI web parts. Now, there's literally dozens and dozens of them. Of interest to us when delivering business intelligence will be the filter web parts. So when you think about the interactivity on a dashboard page, typically you want to prompt for what year, what geographic region, and so on. So there are pre-built web parts that allow us to configure and expose filter options. They can then connect and pass values to the other web parts on a web part page. So notably, here on the list, I have the ability to create a web part filter based on analysis services, so a cube or a data model. Or a SharePoint list, we can expose a data from a list through a SharePoint filter. The first web part that I'll introduce is the chart web part. So when it comes to graphical representation of data, one option that you have is that you can embed this web part direct into a web part page. Now, take note there on the right, there's a very comprehensive set of chart types that are supported. So it might look simplistic, especially when I demonstrate it, but there really are some advanced capabilities built into this web part. So it supports retrieving data from other web parts on the same page, SharePoint list data, business connectivity services, or Excel services. And just a note about SharePoint lists, I often discourage these within the business. Being a database professional, I like the concept that I create and manage and control. But I often have to remind myself that my users are the ones that need the control. And so the ability for them to define their own lists and to create the rules about the data types and the valid values, and then to maintain those values, is a very powerful ability to deliver to them. And then they can start to build reports, charts, and other solutions direct off these lists. I do frown when I see the volume of data in these lists growing and growing, because it's really not there to support tens and tens of thousands of items. While it can, you'll then discover you run into performance issues. All right, first demonstration. Let's take a look at the chart web part. So before me here is my SharePoint BI site. I have enriched it with additional capabilities beyond the basics. And so what I'll point out to you first of all is I have a list here. My users are managing what the quotas should be, broken down by country and year. So these are the expectations of the sales that we need to achieve. So what I need to do is create a web part page that will allow me to filter by year and take a look at the sale quotas for each of the countries. So I navigate to the dashboards library, go ahead and create a new web part page. So like I said, I'm a web developer, but no code is required. And we'll come in here and call this the chart sales quotas. And my template will consist of a header, a left column, and the body will consist of my chart web part. To add the web part, I click on this link, and we'll find under the business data category that I have the chart web part here. I simply add, and to configure it, I click this link here. to configure the data and appearance, and then I connect the chart to data. These are the options to consume data from different sources. In this case, it's a SharePoint list. And then it's just a matter of describing where that list comes from. And there's the data. I'm going to go ahead and apply a filter, which will be by year, which happens to be of type string. And I'll default to the value of 2010 and apply that to see the subset of my list data. Clicking next, how do I want to represent this graphically? We'll see that the quota, the numeric value, will end up on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I'll place the country. I have the ability to also specify that I have a tooltip. So that quota value will show up as a tooltip when I hover over the bar. Just want to point out to you here under data analysis, the formula type. So this is not necessarily just simplistic bar chart. Things like weighted moving average or exponential moving average. There are some very sophisticated algorithms here to go ahead and represent your data. I'm not going to work with them in today's demonstration. Click Finish. That completes the configuration of the chart, which is now added into the body zone of the page. I can come in here and edit the web part. And what I love about this experience is it's all very neat and consistent inside the web browser. So there are numerous properties to go ahead and customize this chart. And all I'm going to do is customize the title and apply that change. Now, located on the left side of the web part page is the left column zone. And I go ahead and add a web part into here, this time from my filters categories. And I'll choose the SharePoint list filter. And then go ahead and open the tool pane to configure the filter. So provide a name for it. I will navigate to the list within my site. And the value that the filter will be based on will be the year. Under Advanced, I can specify a default, like 2010. Provide a title. And I'll update the width to 150 pixels. And OK, that web part is now configured. So all that remains is that I create a connection between the filter and the chart web part. So we have this concept about providers that send values and consumers that consume values. So in this case, the year is a provider that will allow me to send the filter values across to the sales quotas web part. It in turn is the consumer. I can then stop editing the page, and this is the end result. So now users can navigate to this page and then say, well, what did it look like in 2011? Hover over a bar, we get to see the tooltip that shows us the quota for that year, for that country. Okay, any questions about working with the chart web part? See, a common question that would come up is that, oh, I could do that with reporting services, or I could do that with Excel and a pivot chart. So be aware that there are often numerous ways to achieve the same outcome. What is the best way? It's sometimes difficult to provide you guidance around that. It may come down to simply familiarity. What works best for you? What skills do I already have? Okay, do we already have reporting services integrated? If not, well, it's not a choice, and so on. Next topic. This one's pretty short and sweet. The status indicators. Status indicators are there to provide us fact and status. So these are the sales we achieved. Is that good or bad according to the expectations that we have defined? Now, I'm not going to dwell on this topic heavily because performance point services that we will cover is a far richer service application for delivering key performance indicators. But because it's easy to demonstrate and for completeness, I'm going to include it. Be aware that these status indicators can be sourced from SharePoint list data, from an Excel that's been published, from analysis services, or from a fixed value. Now, before I go into the next demonstration on creating a status indicator, let me introduce you to the cube that is used at this fictitious company. So I often see that this is a prerequisite for delivering business intelligence, is that you have a published corporate data model, and that data model exposes data in a way that makes sense, that is consistent, and it meets business requirements. So what I have here is analysis services in multi-dimensional mode. When I drill into the sales analysis database, you'll see that I have a cube named reseller sales. We can browse it, and we'll see the structure of this data is in terms of measures and dimensions. So just as an example, there's my sales. Let's break it down by the products hierarchy, so we can see by category, subcategory, and product. We can also slice by the fiscal hierarchy, and we can then look at the sales that were achieved in fiscal year 2010. So if you're not familiar with these data models, let me just convey the benefits of them. They provide very simplistic interactive browsing. So when users have questions, particularly ad hoc questions, all they need to do is connect to this data model, slice and dice using a tool, maybe like this, maybe an Excel pivot table, to isolate the values of interest that answer their questions. To me, I see this as a prerequisite to support the other business intelligence, like reporting and analytics, that will take place within SharePoint. Don't overlook the fact that this is also a self-service topic. If I had time to talk to you about Power Pivot, these data models could be produced in Excel and published to SharePoint and then consumed in much the same way that I'll demonstrate today. It just so happens in today's examples, this happens to be a corporate data model that has been developed, deployed, maintained by the IT group. So with this background, let me point out that this data model also defines a key performance indicator named sales performance. This data structure allows us to compare actual to target and to qualify this with a status. Is it good? Is it bad? And a trend. Is it getting better over time or worse over time? So where this demonstration leads them is that I can go ahead and create a new list in my library or in my site. And here under the available types, you'll see that you have the status list. So I can go ahead and create a status indicator off those different data stores. In this case, I'll choose analysis services. But it wants to know what data connection to use. And if we navigate to the data connections library, we'll see that we don't have anything defined. Now, I see this the role of the IT group. If they go ahead and deploy corporate data models, then correspondingly, they should create data connections and secure them in SharePoint and then make them available for the general users to go ahead and use consistently for their reporting solutions. So the way that we can create that connection to the cube is actually using Excel. So on the data ribbon, from other sources, from analysis services, I'll go ahead and define the connection details to the instance. That's the database and the cube. Now this all gets wrapped up in an ODC file, an Office Data Connection. So I'll provide a far simpler name for it that makes sense to my end users. And I'll also provide a friendly name for use internally within the workbooks. Where do I save this ODC file? Well, you can save it locally, but as I've just described, a far better practice is that I'm going to go ahead and save that in the Data Connections library. And that gets catalogued as an Office Data Connection file. Now, Excel assumes you want to create a report straight away. I say thank you, but no. And we'll see now that when I switch back and refresh my Data Connections library, here it is. We would then secure that, and then users can help themselves to it. So back on track with my status indicator, when I go ahead and define a new indicator based off analysis services, I can now navigate to that ODC file. It then interrogates the structure and it finds that KPI named sales performance. And then I provide a name for it, which happens to be exactly the same. And now what we see as an item in this status indicators list is the KPI, reporting its value and its goal, and status and trend. What you would typically do with this is embed it in a dashboard page, and then you could slice it by filters, and that will reveal the KPI and values in the corporate model. Any questions about it? Like I say, I don't want to dwell on this topic because it's really passé. We have a far better way to expose KPIs that will be shown to you in an upcoming topic. All right, next topic. Moving along, and perhaps the richest topic we have for delivering business intelligence and reporting through SharePoint is with Excel and Excel services. So Excel services being a service application of SharePoint Server, and be aware we're referring to the Enterprise Edition, allows us to publish workbooks, and the request by the URL for that workbook will result in the server-side rendering of that back to a browser. So this is useful. We can now use Excel as a report writing experience. Instead of distributing the workbook direct to the consumers of the data, we publish it once, secure it, and then we allow people via a single URL to consistently gain access to our reports and the underlying data. So great for real-time, interactive reporting within the web browser. If you have intellectual property, you can hide it. Therefore, when we request the workbook through the server, you can determine what is shown and what is not shown. We also have the Excel Web Access web part. So it's very, very simple, as I'll demonstrate, to embed Excel reports into other web part pages. All right, let's see this in demonstration. So I can now switch back to Excel. And what we'll see is that in this workbook, it does have a workbook connection for reseller sales because I just created it. But think in terms of the fact that as an administrator, I used Excel to publish the ODC file, and now here I am as a business user, going ahead and using that ODC file to create a report. So on the Insert tab, I go ahead and insert a pivot table using the reseller sales. And what we then see here on the right-hand side is the field list that exposes the structure of that cube in terms of measures, KPIs, dimensions, hierarchies. So my intention here is to build a report that will convey sales performance information. And as we saw, we have a key performance indicator that defines this. So let's bring in the 4 metrics of value, goal, status, trend. And what is introduced into the pivot table then are those 4 metrics in terms of values that are formatted, including the indicators here as well. This essentially is, you see the value is actually -1 up here. It's conditional formatting being applied in Excel. Now I'm going to make it a little more readable. So let's override the default names to call this actual, target, status, and trend. And we'll go ahead and format this to make it look really cool. Now, as an overall value, that doesn't convey much to me. What time period are we talking about? What sales territories are we talking about? Well, let's bring in the resources from our dimensions, like from the date dimension, I have fiscal year. So I drag it down onto the report filter, and that allows me to go ahead and filter by a particular time period. So there's the comparison for that fiscal year of actual target, and the great news was we're on track. The slightly bad news is that trend is downwards, which suggests that we're not as good as the prior period, being fiscal year 2009. To provide further context, let me go ahead from the salesperson dimension and place the salespeople hierarchy on the rows. Now, this is what we refer to as slicing and dicing to reveal these values. So now we can drill down through the levels of the hierarchy to see within group, to country, to region, to individuals within the region. So there's a lot we can do with pivot tables. In fact, we could spend 75 minutes alone exploring all of their capabilities. And it's interesting, but it's not going to let me get through this topic. So let me point out a couple of things that I would like to do to complete this. For example, unknown. Not really relevant. Let me right-click, filter, and hide it from the report. Having so many levels like group, region, or country, region is too many. So I can right-click here and say, well, let's go ahead and hide region. So now we can drill straight from the country down to the salesperson. Now, anyone that's consuming this report might be alarmed to see that, for example, shoe is off target, as we see with this indicator. So what do you think they're likely to do, or want to do at that point if they understand that things are not on track? Yeah, find out why. So let's go ahead and extend this report by adding some additional properties like phone number, so that we can easily go ahead and then contact Shu to have a discussion about her performance. All right. To make it even more pretty and convey those values in a way that might be easy to understand, Excel supports conditional formatting. So let's go ahead and apply a data bar and see that I apply it to a single cell, yet with this smart tag, I can then ensure that it's replicated across all cells that are for the actual values at salesperson level. And now we get to see relative distribution of sales within country. And if I expand Canada, you'll see it applies to those as well. Let's do that at country level. So I'll use green and apply it to everything at the country level. And then even at group level, let me use yellow. And I can collapse this. We have some great styles that we can apply, and you can customize these. And that pretty much completes my first report. Really, it's just a matter of minutes. Drag and drop, click, 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 to refine the result that you have. The interactivity that is supported here is drill down, drill up. There's also the ability to filter and sort. Bear that in mind, because that'll work also when we publish it to the server and have this report rendered through the browser. All right, before I move on to my second report within the same workbook, before I do, note here that cell B1 represents the filtered value for time. What I'm going to do is provide a named range for this. So it's a single cell named range, named year. You'll see why. Because in sheet 2, I go ahead and create my second report, which will be sales by product. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'll introduce a pivot table based on the same Office Data Connection file. And this time I'm interested to take a look at the sales amount. And we'll break it down by products. And across the columns, I would like to see the fiscal quarters of the years. All right, now pivot tables are great. They're fast to build, and they're highly interactive for drilling down, filtering, sorting. But sometimes they lack the ability to customize to exactly what I want. And so there's this great ability to take a pivot table and convert it to formulas. This still surprises me that a lot of people don't know about these 7 cube functions that were delivered in Excel 2007. These 7 cube functions allow us to retrieve members and values, or sets, from cubes and place them in individual cells of a worksheet. This provides us extreme flexibility to go ahead and create the report that matches our requirements. So by converting a pivot table, we've fast-tracked the creation of the report, and what you'll see then is that cell B1 is actually the cube member function, that using this workbook connection, it represents this measure within the cube. In cell C2, it's the first quarter. In cell B3, it's the first category of the products hierarchy of the products dimension. And then at the intersection, we use the cube value function. And look, when I edit this, we get to see that the filters, this comma-separated list, is filtering by this measure, this fiscal quarter, and by bicycles. And then it's retrieving the value at the intersection within the cube. So when we break it into a free-form cube function report, we can go ahead and make some modifications. So I'll just update some labels. I'll format this to make it more appealing. And this seems a little odd. The formatting looks good, but server-side that's not going to work. So I'm going to have to reapply numeric formatting. Now, remember that I provided a name range here. So when filtering by 2010, I want that to also pass into my cube value function. So simply by referencing it by the named range, see how this is 80 million? If I then copy this across and I fill without formatting, so that retains the formatting here, we'll now see that the true value for fiscal year 2010 is 27 million. So this ability to inject filter values into the cube value function can be passed from the pivot table filter. They can be passed from the members that you have here. They can also be passed from slices. And what I love about slices, that when they're based on these data connections, in this case, a slicer that will represent the groups that we have, we get this visual filtering capability. And we have styles for them. And if I take a look at the slicer settings, you'll see here that we can reference it in formulas as slicer_salespeople. So now I can come in here and modify the cube value function to also filter by the selection there. Copy that across and down. So now when we say what happened in North America, see that cell by cell, the cube value is being evaluated based on it. There's also multi-selection here. What happened in both Europe and North America? Or just in NA? Well, let's clear that. Next, I want some trend. So another neat capability is that we have spark lines. So the spark line is going to represent the 4 quarters of a year. And then I can copy this down. So at a glance now we can see for North America things sort of dipped, but at the end of the year they came up. And yet for NA it's sort of a little random. Okay, so at a glance the spark line shows us typically time trend information. Last enhancement here is to add some graphical representation, so pivot chart. Based on this range of data here, will show a different perspective of the very same data. So let me just move this into place. So in recognition that this is for 2010, if we take a look at North America, there's a summary of the values, there's the chart that represents it. Okay, so these are very, very powerful ways to build reports based off cubes, or really any BI semantic model if you're in touch with that terminology yet. In SQL Server 2012, we also have tabular approaches to doing this, of which one is Power Pivot. Publish a Power Pivot workbook to SharePoint. You can use these cube functions to go ahead and construct these types of custom free-form reports. So I'm at the point where I've completed my report authoring. This workbook consists of 2 reports. In order to have Excel services render them, I have to publish that workbook. In this case, you don't have to, but typically you're going to publish it to a library within your site. So a little bit of preparation first. So let's go back to the first report. I'm going to hide these. The reason I hide them is that I'm going to use dashboard filters to pass into this. Next, under pivot table options, we can provide a better name for this pivot table than pivot table 1. Note that it doesn't support spaces, so sales performance, one word will do it. For sales by product, I'm going to select this range and I'm going to create a named range, which will be sales by product. I'll then go ahead and hide the grid lines. I can also hide the headings as well, so it doesn't even look like Excel anymore. I'll reset the filters because that's the first view that users are going to see. I'll delete sheet 3, it's not required. And select the very first sheet. So now when I save and send, and I save the entire workbook to SharePoint, before I publish it, I'm going to configure the options. And this is where you can control what Excel services will make available at rendering time. Will it be, as the default is, the entire workbook? Will it be particular sheets or particular items? And I think now you can appreciate why I named those items something that was very friendly and recognizable. So both the pivot table, and that named range representing my freeform report. Now, when I created a named range in my first sheet, it allows me to parameterize that. So I can go and add a parameter based on my year named range, and that will allow filters to pass values in at rendering time. And now that those publication options have been set, I can go ahead and publish this to SharePoint. And I have a library called Excel Reports, and I'll call this my Excel Sales Reports. Now I could have it open it immediately. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to save the document. But you'll see now that when I switch across to SharePoint here and look in that library, there's the report. And if I select it, this is the server-side rendering of that report. Now note we can toggle between the two items here. Sales performance is the pivot table, supports the full interactivity to drill down. Supports interactivity also to go ahead and filter and sort at the different levels of the hierarchy. Switching across to the freeform report, the best that we can do at this stage is interact with the slicer. And that's it. There's no other interactivity that you'll get from this style of reporting. Okay, so what can we do with this? Maybe that's the end of the story. Users simply navigate to that library, select the report, toggle between the available items. Or if we want to build this out into a dashboard, it's pretty straightforward. So in my dashboards library, I'll add a new web part page. And we'll call this the Excel Sales Reports or Dashboard. Adding a web part, so we have web part here under business data for the Excel web access. I add it in, I click here to configure the web part, and then I navigate to the workbook itself. The named item that I want to show here is sales performance, and make sure you spell it exactly as you did when I named that pivot table. I'm not going to have it auto-generate the title, and I don't want a toolbar, so I turn it off. So see the customization here. Even for pivot tables, I can determine that I don't want to allow filtering or sorting. It's up to you when you embed it into your page. And then here under Appearance, instead of using the default, we'll call this Sales Performance, and click OK. Now that's embedded into my web part page. Let me add the second one. So again, Excel Web Access, and this time I'll configure it to use the second report. Sales by product. And we'll probably make that about 500 pixels high. So side by side, my dashboard page consists of the two reports. The last step then is to introduce a filter, this time a filter based on analysis services. And it will be configured to use the same Office Data Connection file. So we'll name this the year filter. Navigate to the ODC file. It then interrogates the structure and it says, well, okay, what dimension? Okay, it'll be from my date dimension and the hierarchy, and consistency pays off here. Remember that I used fiscal year. You must make sure they match. You cannot pass in a different hierarchy into a parameter that it passes into a different filter of the pivot table. So make sure they're the same. Provide a title. And a width of 150 pixels. So the last step then is to define the connections. Upon selecting a filter value, what should happen with that? So I come up here and I say for this filter, connect, send its values to sales performance. So whatever the values are that are selected, pass it into, and there's just the one parameter on this workbook that I had exposed. So pass this into year. That in turn was, remember, cell B1 of the first worksheet. And then I simply repeat that to define the connection between the filter and the second Excel Web Access web part. And now I can stop editing, we can publish this. Anyone that navigates to this page now has the ability to come in here and select the year of interest. So let's take a look at 2011, and that updates both web parts. And the interactivity that's supported on my dashboard page includes the ability to use the slicer. So we see our spark lines, we see updated values, we see the chart, and the ability to interact with the pivot table. Okay, all from Excel and Excel services. Any questions about working with Excel for reporting? Again, can I emphasize the prerequisite of having a data model in place? Really, the power of what I just did was because we had a data model in place that allowed me very conveniently to assemble those reports with pivot tables and so on. I have a question, yes? So the question is, because I've used a multi-dimensional model, which is a cube, is there anything that I would lose if it was a tabular model? Essentially, no. The tabular model exposes an interface that looks like a cube, so you will have the very same experience that I just had. Perhaps one thing that you won't have will be that a KPI doesn't have a trend metric, whereas in multi-dimensional it supports it. But as far as measures, dimensions, hierarchies, you can replicate that in a tabular model. That could be with Power Pivot or a tabular project. All right, we'll then move on. No, I have an additional question.
Is there any possibility to add a description of the values or KPI I have to the data model to provide it as a comment or remark to the user when he uses this object section later on?
Okay, so the question is that we might need to provide descriptions and information about a KPI. How can we do that? So you can put descriptions in your data model, but they won't flow through in Excel. Okay. What you could do is, let me just show you when I switch back. The status indicator does have a solution for this. Hold on. If I come to the status indicators and you edit this, you'll see that you can provide a URL to some document that then provides them further information. Beyond that, in Excel, you could include a hyperlink. So you can include in a cell, here's a hyperlink to a PDF in a library that actually provides you further information about it. Okay? All right, we'll move on to the topic of performance point services. So the specialty of performance point services is performance management. It's there to answer the question, how are we going? Are we meeting expectations, plans, budgets, and so on? Now, typically what happens is that when you discover that something isn't meeting expectation, what's the next type of question that arises? Why? So we introduce the analytics. So there's the what, and then we have the why. So think how powerful it is to assemble a single dashboard experience that allows filtering, typically by time, to explore what has happened. And in situations where expectations haven't been met, that you have corresponding analytic reports that allow you then to interact and explore and discover the answers as to why performance is not meeting expectation. And essentially that's what this product, this service application, delivers. Now, it's a little complex in the sense that there are 7 different elements that are constructed to produce a performance point services dashboard. It all starts with a data source that connects to typically a cube. I would strongly recommend that you have a data model, be it tabular or multidimensional. You will get the best interactive experience. I'll explain why in demonstration. But you may also choose to connect to SharePoint list data, Excel services data as well. In addition, SQL Server relational data can be used. Having defined the data source, you'll typically publish this. In fact, I would expect IT would publish it. And if you do expect that business analysts would go ahead and create solutions, they would have permission to consume these data sources. They could then define key performance indicators. That'll answer the question, how are we going? These are represented through indicators. Now, there are great libraries of indicators already included, but you can customize to use your own images and labels. Now, these end up in scorecards. This is the item that is dropped into a dashboard, and a scorecard essentially is a report that conveys KPI information. They can be structured in various different ways. They could use hierarchies of objectives and so on to then represent the KPIs and aggregate scores to produce an overall score of performance. This is a specialty topic. I don't have time to go in detail on it today, but this product is very versatile in allowing you to define different types of scorecards. And these scorecards can also use the data source to help slice and dice information, like an interactive report. So these four elements deliver the monitoring capabilities to answer, how are we going? When things aren't going too well, we then have reports that answer the analytics side. Why are things happening? And there are very rich types of reports, be them the analytic grid or chart. Now, they only work on top of the data models, the BI semantic model, be it multidimensional or tabular. That is the rich interactivity that you will get in a zero-footprint web browser, and I'll demonstrate that. But in addition, you can use reporting services reports, you can use the Excel services reports. Visio diagrams can be placed in there as well. Even just a URL to another web resource can be used inside your dashboard. Now, the deliverable from Performance Point Services is a dashboard, and we're not there yet. Typically, a dashboard will require filters. Filter by time, filter by geographic region. And it's the filters, scorecards, and reports that get assembled to produce dashboards. Now, when you deploy the dashboard, it actually results in a web part page. So it does all of the hard work for you that you may have manually done in SharePoint yourself. So let's see this come together in a demonstration, assembling and deploying a Performance Point Services dashboard. So I start by navigating to the Data Connections library, and here I am wearing the IT administrator's hat. This is something I think should be set up in advance, and I'll go ahead and create a Performance Point data source. Now, to produce Performance Point Services solutions, there is a Windows application known as Dashboard Designer. It's installed through a click-once deployment, and so you see that it's been installed and it's just about to launch. There we go. And it's prompting me for one of the 5 supported types, be it analysis services, Excel services, importing raw data from an Excel workbook, data in a SharePoint list, or data in a SQL Server table or view. Well, I'm going to exploit the fact that I already have a data model available. This is very much in line with business intelligence, that we like consistency, we like to deliver data as a single version of the truth. So you'll note that most of my demonstrations are coming from the same data model. So selecting analysis services, it goes ahead and creates a new data source for me. This will be my reseller sales. And I configure it to use this instance. And on this instance, it finds this database. And within this database, it finds that single cube. Now be aware that when you save, the items that you see here in the workspace browser actually published back, in this case, to the Data Connections library. So this is available now for reuse. That many KPIs, scorecards, and reports and filters can be based off this single definition. Back to Dashboard Designer. I then add in an additional list. And so in my site, I have a Performance Point content list, and this is where the remaining 6 other element types can be added. So the starting point here will be to go ahead and typically add a key performance indicator. Now I'm going to fast track it in this demonstration by creating a scorecard directly. And when I base it off an analysis services data source, being my reseller sales, I have choice. I can define new KPIs based on the measures found within this model. Or I could choose to import the KPIs from this model, and that's preferable. This single version of the truth, if the Cube developer has defined the KPIs there, we should just let them flow through and become part of our performance point solution. But I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to go ahead and create a new KPI that doesn't even exist in the Cube. So when I click Add here, it shows me all of the possible measures, and I select gross profit margin %. And I'm going to create a KPI named sales profitability. Increasing is getting better. If the profit percentage goes up, this is a good thing. If I was measuring customer complaints, well, it would be a bad thing if customer complaints went up. So it's a natural thing for you just to determine based on what you're measuring whether increasing is better or decreasing is better. It might actually be that closer to target is better. If I'm manufacturing, I don't know, a pencil, and the pencil must be 10 centimeters long, well, 11 centimeters exceeds that, but that's not good. And 9 centimeters is too much below, so closer to target is what I'm looking for. All right, so in this case, increasing is better. The target, now this would be preferable, that the target value was also in my data model, but it isn't. All right, so I have to choose something, so I just choose the same measure. This is actually nonsensical at this stage, but we'll fix this. And I could add more KPIs if I want. So this wizard is just fast-tracking the creation of KPIs. Do I want to filter the KPI by a measure or some other member? No. Now, because it's also creating a scorecard for me and a KPI, it says, well, should I put any members across the columns of the scorecard? No. And where do I store the KPIs? In this list here. Click Finish. You'll see in my workspace the addition of 2 items. We have the sales profitability KPI and we have my new scorecard. And let me name this the sales scorecard. All right, before we look at the scorecard, I select the KPI, and this is the definition. At minimum, a KPI must consist of an actual and a target. What happened? What did we expect to happen? And here we see the actual mapping to this measure. I'm going to update the format so it does express it as a percentage. Now for the target, using the same measure is really inappropriate. It's always going to equal the same thing. Like I've mentioned, it would be better if the Cube had a measure that allowed me to compare to the budgeted gross profit. So what I'm going to do is change the source to a fixed value. And in this case, the fixed value will be we must achieve 3% profit margin. That is the goal. We'll update the format. Now for that target or that goal metric, we get to specify the thresholds here. So what is good is green. What is bad is red. And in between, what is yellow is slightly bad, but not to be overly concerned about. Now you can define your own indicators. They don't necessarily need to be 3. They could be 5, 10, 11. So I'm going to keep things simple here. And my rule will be that if you meet the goal, then it's green. If you're 80% the way to the goal, then you're slightly off track. Anything else is the red one down here. And that's my definition for the key performance indicator. I can now go ahead and save this and be aware that that gets saved back to my performance point content list. So that's available for reuse by other analysts. I like that KPI. Let me add it to my workspace and to my scorecards. Again, single version of the truth going on here. Now, our attention on the scorecard itself shows that the KPI has automatically been added. Here on the edit ribbon, we can update to see what the new definition looks like against real data. But be careful not to interpret the values that you see yet because they're not being filtered by a time period. So the aggregate for actual and target may not be in sync. All right? So don't interpret anything yet until it's embedded into a dashboard page and that we can filter consistently by a time period. So I'm going to simplify things here. I'm going to actually remove the actual. So I'll delete this. For the target, I want to show the actual and no variance. So all I get to see will be the actual result of our profit margin and the indicator, green, yellow, or red. The reason that I've made it simple is because I'm going to come into my dimensions, and these are the dimensions of the underlying data source, reseller sales. And we'll come into date, and we'll put fiscal quarter of year up here. All right, now this is pretty cool. You can just right-click here and dynamically select everything. I wouldn't expect new fiscal quarters to be added. There's quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. But if they're products or countries, the ability to define a dynamic rule there will mean it will work over time. As a new country is added to the data model, it will appear in our scorecard. Click Update, and now we get to see the 4 quarters. Again, be careful not to interpret anything yet. We're not filtering on an actual year. Likewise, I'm going to bring in salesperson, and I'm going to place them under profitability. And I'm interested to show, why don't we dynamically select all of the countries? And now we have the scorecard that shows us the fiscal quarters, profit achieved, and status broken down by country. And we can also drill down, if necessary, to the regions and the individuals within there. Now, last thing I do is come in here and make this underline and color blue. What do you think that's going to represent to a user? All right, there's some hint going on here that there's an action that can be performed. By selecting a member on this hierarchy, it's going to do something. And we'll see that come together in the dashboard. So now I can go ahead and save this scorecard. And that's the completion of the monitoring development. Now, to answer the questions, why are we off track? Let's go and introduce a couple of reports. Add a new report. These are the reports that are supported. The analytic chart and grid are the most powerful. They are interactive within the web browser. However, they must be based on an analysis services BI semantic model. If you're aware that Microsoft some years ago purchased ProClarity, this is where ProClarity features surfaced through these 2 reports in Performance Point Services. So let's start with an analytic grid. Based on the reseller sales data source, and I'm going to call this my sales person details report. Here is the structure of the data model. So let's place the salesperson hierarchy on the rows, and more specifically, I dynamically want all the salespeople to be placed on the rows. And let's go ahead and show some measures, like what sales did they achieve, what sales amount quota, and what profitability did they achieve. This is a great test, by the way. It's one thing that you achieve quota. If we had one KPI that said, did you or did you not achieve quota, that could introduce some really undesirable behavior. Because if someone's not meeting quota, what they're likely to do is start discounting heavily, potentially making losses. So to actually track what profit you're achieving and ensuring that meets a target, and at the same time that you're meeting your quota, is an effective way of keeping your salespeople focused in the business. So those 3 measures will be helpful to analyze why. Lastly, I place the fiscal year in the background. Now, I'm not actually filtering on something, and that's what the background means. But it does allow me to pass a filter value into the background via that definition. Now, simply through that drag and drop, it produced this MDX query, which is the language used to query a multi-dimensional model. So I can go ahead and save that. The second report is going to be very straightforward. Let me point out to you the other supported types. Excel services. What are the details of a KPI? So back to the question earlier, details like information about the KPI can also be conveyed here. This is for legacy Pro Clarity applications, reporting services reports, whether they're in native or SharePoint mode, Visio strategy maps, or any URL to a web resource. Well, let's go and reuse the Excel report that I created earlier. So the configuration for this report is pretty straightforward. I'm going to introduce the sales performance. So what is the URL to my site? What library within the site? Okay, 3 L's doesn't help. There's the Excel report that I published. And within the workbook, we have these 2 items. So let's use sales performance. Note the way it understands there's a parameter named year, and that will become the endpoint for my dashboard filter to pass into. And I simply save this off. So the final step to configure and assemble a dashboard is to start by defining a filter. This filter will be based off the selection of members in a hierarchy of my data model. What data connection, what dimension, and hierarchy. So I choose the fiscal year hierarchy. Again, consistency pays off. What members? We'll dynamically select all of them. So in the future, as we add 2013, 2014, they will appear here. And represent this as a single list. And we'll name that the year filter. So finally, we can assemble this dashboard. We have a template here. Be aware that what we're configuring, once deployed, will be a web part page in SharePoint. So this will be my profitability page. It will consist of the year filter, my sales scorecard, and my salesperson details. To define the connections, here for the year filter, whatever the member unique name is, I drop it into the scorecard and filter the scorecard. Now we'll get to see realistic values in the scorecard. I do the same thing for that filter to pass into the salesperson details. Remember the background I defined? There it is. And then finally, the members on the rows, pass them into the report into the salespeople hierarchy. We'll see the effect of that shortly. I'm going to add a second page to the dashboard using the same template, this time for performance. Using the same filter, I'm going to delete the right zone, and then I'll place that Excel sales performance report in there and pass the unique year into the year parameter of the Excel report. And my work is done. So that's my PPS sales dashboard. We save it, and the last step then, and it's the only item that is deployed, is we deploy the dashboard. Which library? My dashboards library. It will create a folder in that library, and then for each page within the dashboard, it will create a web part page that will consist of the items and connections that I have defined. And here it is. So we filter on 2011. We get to see the 4 quarters. That doesn't look like a very successful year. Straight 2010 looks a little more healthy. And we want more information about NA. The selection here, you'll see, passes across its context to allow us to see the individual salespeople down here. Now, this is an incredibly rich experience that I like to pop out into its own window. And a right click will show you the extraordinary functionality that's delivered here in this zero footprint web client. So let me go ahead and first of all remove these levels. So I just have the 3 employees. I can select the measures that I want to show beyond the default. Get rid of profitability. Just show me the sales amount and the quota. And now show me that in graphical representation. And we can pivot this so we get to see the individuals with their sales versus quota. This is all interactive. I can start drilling across the other hierarchies within the model. The tooltips here will show me statistics. Switch back to grid. Repivot. I can sort, I can filter. Or I can then pay closer attention to Amy here, who is well off track. I think. Actually, she's well on track. Let's not get too carried away. But let's assume she wasn't, and I want to interrogate this further. First of all, show details. Can show me details in the data model. Now, be aware if I export this to Excel, I could then start using Power Pivot to start analyzing this more thoroughly. So this is a great way to retrieve a subset of data through this tool. I could go ahead and drill across, go ahead and show me, for Amy, what's the breakdown across the product categories. Let's go ahead and hide the sales quota and bring in that gross profit margin. And let's drill down to understand what she's achieved. Wow. Not selling at a profit here for road bikes. What if I right-click and perform a decomposition tree? We can now see for what Amy has done, how does this compare over the months of the year? Okay, and then in August, where is she selling to? The cities and so on. So it's very easy then to start drilling down and isolating the values of interest to answer that question. Why is this going on? Okay, the great news about this is all supported in the web browser. That decomposition tree is the one exception. It is Silverlight, but everything else is standard web browser. And that's the end of my Performance Point Services dashboard. All right, one topic to cover, and that brings us to Visio services. So many of you are probably already familiar with Visio as a diagramming tool. Perhaps you're not familiar that if you publish diagrams to SharePoint, you can bring them to life with data. And when you do so, you can enrich your dashboard and reporting experiences through diagrams and data collectively. So we can refresh data, we can connect to SQL Server data, SharePoint list data, Excel services. Notably, we cannot connect to Analysis Services cubes, not directly anyway. And that there is a web part that allows us to embed our diagrams into web part pages. So let's see this in action with a demonstration. So I have a list here of the 5 servers at the company. You'll see it consists of the name of the server, the status, who the administrator is, and the percentage uptime. Our email server looks to be doing pretty poorly, only up half the time, and it's presently offline. Now I switch across to a pre-built diagram. So there's nothing special about this diagram so far. It's a collection of shapes. It's made to look pretty. When we right-click on a shape here, we can see that there is data properties for shapes. And you'll see that already configured for these is the server name. That's a starting point. What I'm going to do is use the Data tab here to introduce data from that SharePoint list. So connecting to my server status list, I've now imported those 5 items. This is known as a data set. Now I right-click, and I'm going to go ahead and just turn off some columns. So let's just focus on what's necessary for this project. So there's all sorts of things I don't want here. So I consist of just these server status admin uptime. Now watch what happens when I take this item and I drag and drop it onto this shape. Okay, what I'm trying to point out here, let me close this, is that it's added additional properties to the shape. And it's now connected that item to that shape and enriched the property collection of the shape and values. Now that could be tedious to drag and drop what could be many, many items. So we have this ability to go ahead and automatically link. So let me go ahead and bring up where is my data set? I think I need to bring it in again. Okay, I'm trying to work at a different resolution and show you everything at the same time. Okay, so that one we connect again, there is this ability to automatically link. So all shapes on this page, let's link where the condition is that the server name matches. Remember, each shape already has its server name. And you'll then see these chain link icons are telling us that everything's now linked. Okay, and that's the first step. We've now related data to the shapes. Let's then show that data in different ways. So let me just multi-select all of those shapes, and then here we can go ahead and create data graphics. So the first one I'm going to create is by using the server field, and I'm going to use a text display. So let's display it using this style, 12 points, center it, and I want it to appear at the very top of the shape. And now you'll see we have the names of the servers across here. Let me add a second item, this time for the uptime %, shown as a data bar, and I will use the data bar 2. Let's position this again at the center and at the very bottom, and apply. And now we can graphically see that this one's up, but this one is down half the time. One more, the status of the server will be shown. You have a choice here. You could color the shape, but I'm going to use an icon set. And so if it's online, it'll use this icon, and if it's offline, it will use this icon. All right, and we can see the email server is presently offline. So the next step is to publish this, save and send, save to SharePoint. You need to save it as a web drawing. This is important. And then we'll save this to, and I have a Visio diagrams. And now that it's published. So the cool thing about this is we can embed this into a dashboard page. So let me create one last web part page. Add the web part that is my business data, the Visio web access. Configure it. And there's the published diagram. This is very cool. By default, it will not automatically refresh, but I want it to refresh every minute. So it's this unattended dashboard that shows the status of the servers. And I'll leave the other properties, but you can configure all of the capabilities that will be supported. And then we have the server-side rendering of this Visio diagram taking place. And we'll enable that refresh automatic. And there it is. Now, take a look how cool this is. All right. So you get full vector graphics here. Very, very, very crisp, supported in the browser. So what would happen then if I come across to my list and I edit this to reflect the fact that the email server is now online? So we'd expect within a minute, then this is automatically going to update. So while we're waiting for that, are there any questions about Visio services? One question there in the back. So the question is, right, Visio Services doesn't connect directly to analysis services. The way that I've worked around that is I create an Excel report that uses the cube functions, and then I publish that to SharePoint, and then I can base a Visio diagram on Excel services. All right, so that's a way you can work around it. Did that email server just come online? All right, it proved the fact that that auto refresh just works. And now we'd expect live updates every minute at least of what's going on for our servers. All right, so that's the final demonstration. Let me wrap up in summary by emphasizing the fact that the built-in BI features are designed to empower not just the IT group, but business users. Do you note there that I didn't write one query or one line of code to produce the solutions that I did? This capability is delivered through built-in web parts and service applications. You can make this even more powerful with reporting services and Power Pivot, but time didn't let me. We saw that we can create dashboard pages using filters, charts, status indicators, scorecards, reports, and diagrams, and that we don't require the users that assemble these solutions to know how to code or query. You can to create more sophisticated solutions, but it's not necessarily a requirement. I want to leave you with some resources. There's some great resources here about BI in SharePoint Server. This one typically comes up. Well, if I want to create a KPI, I have so many options. Is it Excel? Is it reporting services? Is it status indicators? Is it performance point services? There's a great document here on how to choose the right BI technology to suit your style. It goes into a lot of detail about the choices you have and the considerations that you'll factor in to your decision making. And then I'll leave you with some resources here. This deck is downloadable through your TechEd site. Further information about the other products that I demonstrated today. All right, there are some great labs to explore as well. I know this because I wrote them. All right. So, performance point services, Excel, Visio diagrams, and I think reporting services based on a tabular BI semantic model. Check them out here at the hands-on lab station. Typical resources that you'll see all this week. Evaluations is very, very important. Could you please take the effort using this URL to go ahead and evaluate this session? Your feedback is very important to understand whether we're meeting your needs. We'd love to hear any feedback that you have also. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and attendance.